Hey guys, tonight we travel back to a world where bread wasn't just food, it was law, punishment, pride, and sometimes just a really good way to lose your livelihood. Imagine this. You're hunched under a timbered ceiling, warm light flickering from a soot-choked fire. Around you, the scent of yeast, ash, and maybe a faint whiff of desperation. The baker wipes sweat off his brow, muttering to himself as he double-checks the weight of a coarse loaf. Not because he's a perfectionist, but because if it's a few ounces short, he might be dragged to the public square and mocked in front of your crush, your landlord, and a chicken named Bernard. You, dear listener, are that baker tonight. And you probably won't survive this. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Feel free to drop your location and what time it is where you are. I love seeing how far this little bread cart of a channel travels. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge into the bakehouse before dawn, footsteps echoing on cold flagstones. Your breath fogs as you heave open the flour chest. Coarser stuff today, from the miller down the road who claims it's clean, but you saw him sneeze directly into the sack yesterday. Still, you're on a schedule. Because in this little English town, circa 1320-something, baking bread isn't just about feeding the masses. It's about staying alive and memorizing every single rule. Bread, weirdly enough, is life and death. A failed loaf could mean fines. Repeated offenses, the stocks. And if you really mess up, like adding filler that makes people hallucinate or violently purge, the punishments get more creative. The pillory, public shaming, or being banned from baking entirely, which is basically a career death sentence in a society where carbs are 70% of your daily caloric intake. Bread is sacred. It's survival. It's how peasants stay full, monks stay focused, and knights stay not dead during crusades. So of course, it's heavily regulated, because when grain is life, controlling grain is power. That's where the laws come in. And not just a few. We're talking dozens of specific rules about flour grades, bread weight, pricing ratios, baking times, and even where your oven should face. Spoiler, not west, unless you enjoy heat gods scowling at you. There's something wonderfully bonkers about medieval priorities. Kings were too busy warring and taxing, but heaven forbid a baker shortchange a customer by 2 crumbs. That's treasonous behavior. The first thing you learn as an apprentice is that bread isn't just food. It's a contract, a promise, between you and the community. Mess it up, the whole market loses trust. And when trust breaks in a feudal society, people riot over bread. And they did. A lot. Which is why you memorize the weight of a farthing loaf. It's not just meh, eyeball it. It must weigh precisely the amount tied to the cost of a bushel of wheat divided by a holy ratio last updated by a dead monarch during a solar eclipse. Historians still argue whether this was clever policy or just the product of a very bored bureaucrat with a fondness for fractions. But here you are, weighing dough balls by candlelight, whispering bread laws like they're sacred scripture. Because they kind of are. Your oven, brick, dome-shaped, terrifying, is already glowing. You feed it with wood from your designated stack. Only certain woods are allowed, of course, while keeping your eyes out for the bread inspectors, who are known to appear unannounced, wearing frowns that could curdle milk. Now you knead. Press, shape. Loaves line up like little soldiers ready for war. Some will go to the tavern, others to the monastery, and a few to the fussy nobleman up the road who insists his crust not resemble the texture of roof tiles. You smile politely and ignore the fact that your roof tiles are probably made from the same stuff. But there's something beautiful about this rhythm too. The hum of effort. The smell of rising yeast. The flicker of fire. Baking is one of the few communal rituals that survives plagues, feasts, and royal proclamations. It's humbling, honest, and utterly exhausting. And still, deep breath, you double-check every single loaf. Because if you get it wrong, you might be accused of light breading, which sounds delightful, but actually means your loaves are underweight and you're a fraud. Punishment could be as simple as a fine, or as elaborate as being paraded through the streets, carrying a fake loaf labeled cheat, while the town children throw damp turnips. Yes, really. One fringe account even mentions a baker being made to wear a necklace of stale rolls while reciting the assize of bread in Latin. No one knows if it's true, but everyone wants it to be. What's worse, sometimes you do everything right and you still get in trouble because flour purity is a gamble. The miller might have slipped in some chaff, or oat husks, or, bean flour. It's cheaper, sure, but technically illegal unless properly declared. And if someone falls ill, that's your oven they come knocking on. One baker in Kent was even blamed for a spirit attack after a villager got the sweats from moldy rye. You know what they did? Dug up his hearth and poured holy water on it. That's your future, all over some crust. But still, you keep baking, because this is your livelihood, your art, your weirdly dangerous, flour-covered life.
You watch the loaves darken in the oven.
Pull them out with the long-handled peel, tapping each for the telltale thump that says, yes, I am both legally compliant and delicious. As the sun creeps over the town walls, you line your goods on the stall. The market bustles awake. A child runs past with a hot roll. Someone mutters about pricing again. A monk eyes your sweet loaf like it's been personally blessed by Saint Eustace. And you, baker, survivor, human bread machine, begin another day under the looming eye of 47 rules. And count. You lean against the stall for just a second, barely a breath, when you hear it. Oi! This loaf's light! The words hit like a bad batch of barley beer. Your heart skips, your fingers twitch. You know your bread was the right weight. You triple-checked. But it doesn't matter. The accusation's out. The crowd hears it. Heads turn, and somewhere in the back of your skull you feel the cold grip of the adze of bread and ale tightening around your neck like a flour-dusted noose. The adze of bread. 3 little words that sound harmless enough, until you realize it's basically the IRS, FDA, and witch-hunting tribunal all rolled into one delightfully bureaucratic scroll. Enacted in England in 1266, it wasn't just a law, it was the law. This thing micromanaged your bread like a helicopter parent at a bake sale. It dictated exactly how much a loaf should weigh, depending on the cost of wheat. If grain prices rose, the size of your loaf shrank accordingly. If they fell, your loaf had to expand like it had joined a medieval gym. There's even a hilarious little chart, well, historians think it was hilarious, where the weight of bread adjusted like clockwork to the price of a quarter of wheat. Some loaves weighed 12 pounds, some half a pound, and God help you if you didn't have the mental arithmetic of a monk hopped up on caffeine. The adze didn't stop at bread either. Nope, it tagged in ale, just to make things more fun. Now, if you were a brewer, you'd be sweating just as much, since a weak or overpriced ale could land you next to the bakers in the pillory, or worse, banned from your tavern for life, which in medieval terms was social obliteration. People cared. The adze was posted in public markets, and villagers learned to read them, recite them, and angrily quote them like they were gospel. Picture a crowd standing in front of your stall, loudly arguing whether your 2-farthing loaf should weigh 4 pounds or 3 pounds and 14 ounces, depending on the last market declaration, the day's weather, and whether the bishop had sneezed that morning. And if they decided you were wrong, That's where the bread wardens came in. Yep, that's a real title. Bread wardens. Not to be confused with bread lords or yeast masters, though let's be honest, those would have made better business cards. These guys had power. Appointed by local authorities, sometimes backed by the guild, they were like angry uncles with clipboards and the legal right to rummage through your bread rack. They checked weights, inspected ingredients, sniffed your flour for impurities, and, best of all, dropped by unannounced. One moment you're slicing a warm rye for a hungry customer, the next you're being told your crust is suspiciously thin.
What happens if they catch you breaking the law? Public punishment, obviously. This was the Middle Ages. Shame was the main form of entertainment. First offense? Fined. Not too bad. Unless your entire weekly profit margin was now going to pay for someone else's donkey feed. Second offense? The pillory. You, standing in the middle of the square, locked by the neck and wrists, while people throw whatever they have on hand. Rotten eggs, pebbles, damp bread rolls. Oh, the irony. And yes, the town crier will absolutely shout your name and offense with enough dramatic flair to qualify for theater. Third offense? Banished from baking. Forever. Your oven sealed, your flour confiscated. You, reduced to selling eels or scrubbing pots in a tavern run by your former apprentice who definitely doesn't let you forget it. Historians still argue whether the assize was actually effective. On one hand, it did standardize things in a chaotic world. On the other, it turned simple tradesmen into nervous wrecks memorizing math tables in their sleep. One scribe wrote that a baker was seen muttering grain to loaf ratios while walking in circles, possibly a nervous breakdown, possibly a side effect of breathing too much rye dust. But let's be fair, it wasn't just about catching cheats. The assize was also designed to protect consumers in a world where famine, fraud, and weird mushroom bread could kill you. If a poor family spent their only coin on a loaf and it turned out hollow, moldy, or full of crushed beans and barley husks, that wasn't just disappointing. That was survival gone. Which brings us to the real joke here. The assize expected perfect accuracy, but gave you wildly inconsistent tools. Your weights were handmade. Your scales probably leaned to the left. And grain? Well, grain varied wildly in quality and size depending on where it came from, how it was milled, what the miller ate for breakfast, and whether or not a pigeon pooped in the bag during transport. So you, the baker, were expected to perform a daily act of economic clairvoyance. Guess the price of wheat, calculate legal loaf weight, adjust for humidity, avoid bean filler, monitor your yeast, and still get your product out before first bell. Oh, and if you happen to undercut the guy 2 stalls down, that could spark a bread war. They'd accuse you of unfair loafing, which, sadly, is not about napping but underpricing to ruin competition. The guild would step in, or worse, your rival might sneak bad flour into your sack during the night. You think I'm kidding? One fringe record from York mentions a baker who swore revenge after losing customers and allegedly paid a stable boy to urinate into a competitor's dough vat. Not exactly sanitary, not exactly subtle, but absolutely peak medieval business strategy. And still, through all of this, the assize held firm. Loaf after loaf, year after year. Kings died, crusades failed, but bread? Bread must remain regulated. So you keep your eyes down, keep baking, and pray that the next loaf isn't half an ounce too light. Because you really, really don't want to meet the bread wardens again.
You're at the market again. Same stall, different sunrise.
Someone's already haggling 3 stalls down over a suspicious turnip. Your neighbor, old Maud, is loudly whispering that you've been using cloud flour, which isn't real, but sounds shady enough to cause concern. And you're sweating over a pile of perfectly good loaves that might be technically illegal. Why? Because medieval economics is a fever dream. See, the assize of bread and ale didn't just say, make a good loaf. It demanded that you anchor your prices to the cost of wheat, a number that shifted constantly depending on the harvest, local weather, plague, bandits, divine wrath, and whether or not your local tax collector got out of bed feeling petty. You don't get to set your prices based on how hard you worked or how good your crust is.
You get to use a chart. A long, weird chart based on the quarter of wheat. That's 8 bushels. But not all bushels are equal. Depending on where you live, a bushel might be dry or heaped, or based on some baron's uncle's opinion from 50 years ago. You think you're selling a 3-penny loaf? Surprise! Wheat went up half a pence overnight. Now that same loaf is fraud. And the kicker? You're expected to know this. There's no medieval newsletter, no push notification. You hear it through town criers or, more dangerously, through gossip. One day, the mayor's nephew insists the grain rate is down. The next day, someone gets arrested because they followed that info and mispriced their barley loaf. Historians still argue whether the medieval bread pricing system was a clever form of market stabilization or just sadistic algebra disguised as civic virtue. So you sit at your stall, muttering numbers like a monk possessed. Now, let's talk weights. The weight of your loaf had to mirror the value of the ingredients. If grain was cheap, your loaf had to be heavy. If grain was expensive, your loaf shrank like a wet cloak in the sun. You couldn't just raise your price. That was illegal. The idea was that bread should always be affordable to the average peasant, even if you, the baker, had to take a hit. The crown wanted stability, not riots. They'd rather bankrupt a baker than risk another grain revolt. Fair? No. But predictable? Also no. Oh, and the weights? Good luck. Scales were handmade and often wildly inaccurate. The little metal stones you used as counterweights might be stolen, forged, or slightly worn from constant use. A loaf might weigh perfectly on your scale and come up short on the bread warden.
That's how you end up fined for a phantom short weight, a loaf that was perfectly fine 5 minutes ago and is now criminal because of the inspector's warped scale or a breeze that dried out the crust. You try to explain. They roll their eyes. You're told to memorize the grain conversion chart again. There's a real historical quote that goes something like this: "No baker can honestly keep the assize unless he be a wizard or a liar." And honestly, both sound easier than what you're doing. Even currency made things worse. Coins were clipped constantly. People would shave little bits of silver off the edge to hoard tiny flecks. So the value of money also shifted, meaning that even if your loaf's weight was perfect and the wheat rate correct, your customer might pay with a clipped penny, and now you're selling below legal cost. It's economic whack-a-mole. Let's not forget, every town, village, and borough might interpret the rules slightly differently. In London, bakers had to post a public list of loaf types and corresponding weights. In York, they were fined for naming loaves fancy things, like monk's belly, if they weren't up to snuff. A misnamed bun could spark a mini trial. One poor soul in Norwich tried selling a pilgrim crust that was too thin. His punishment? Standing outside his stall with a giant wooden spoon around his neck labeled hollow.
And yet, this is the system you live in. You memorize every price fluctuation from the past 40 days like it's sacred text. You use coins that might be counterfeit. You kneel before a sack of grain and pray it hasn't gone musty. Because you know, if a loaf comes out 1 ounce too light, again, you'll be writing your next apology on a plank of wood, tied to your head. You try shortcuts. Everyone does. One baker adds stale crumbs into the dough to stretch it. Another uses ash to darken crusts so they look more rustic and filling. A third bribes the bread warden with free sweet buns on St. Crispin's Day. But each shortcut carries risk, because you never know which day the inspector actually does his job. One historical tidbit suggests that inspectors in larger towns would time their visits to market day when bakers were busiest and most likely to slip. Kind of evil. Very effective. But hey, not every story ends in shame. There's a tale from Shrewsbury about a young baker who got accused of short-weighting loaves, only to produce his own grain chart complete with notes and corrections from a local friar. It stunned the bread wardens into letting him off with a warning, and he later became head of the guild. Probably framed that chart and slept with it under his pillow. It's moments like that, tiny victories that keep you going, Because for every sour-faced inspector or paranoid neighbor, there's a hungry family buying your bread with their last coin. A little kid biting into a fresh roll and grinning. A friar who trades you beeswax for a round of rye. In a world this confusing, bread is the one thing people still trust. So you count your loaves, double-check your math, glare at your questionable scale, and sigh. Only 44 more rules to memorize.
You're dreaming about bread again. Not in a fun, warm blanket, sourdough hug kind of way. No, this is a stress dream. You're standing in front of your oven, but instead of loaves, there are scrolls inside. Flaming parchment. The asses of bread and ale roasting over coals. You reach in to pull one out and wake up gripping your own arm like it's a baguette. Welcome to the psychological side of medieval baking. It's easy to laugh from the future, watching your favorite history YouTuber sip tea and talk about ye old carbohydrate enforcement squad. But in your world, the mental weight of this system is crushing. Every single day you walk a tightrope between survival and scandal. And sleep? That's a luxury you can't always afford. See, the job of a baker didn't start at sunrise. It started well before. Midnight, even earlier in winter. You're up in the darkness, fumbling with kindling, testing yesterday's coals, whispering curses when they don't catch. If your fire doesn't take, your dough doesn't rise. If your dough doesn't rise, your livelihood collapses like a badly proofed rye. And yet, even when everything does go right, you're still walking on eggshells. You second-guess every step. Did I grind the millet too fine? Did that sack of barley come from the south mill or the east one? Did I calculate the loaf weight based on yesterday's wheat rate or this morning's rumor? Because at the end of the day, the law doesn't care about your intentions. It cares about your compliance. And that eats at you. You start seeing rules everywhere. You half dream in conversions. You catch yourself reciting the asses aloud while kneading dough. Your apprentice walks in on you whispering, "A halfpenny at 2 shillings per quarter is 6 pounds avoirdupois," and quietly backs out like he just saw a ghost. Even outside the bakery, it haunts you. You're at the tavern trying to enjoy a mug of ale. Also regulated, remember? Someone says they heard a baker in the next village got pilloried for cutting loaves with turnip pulp. The entire table gasps, then turns to you. Do you do that? Are your loaves honest? You laugh it off, but your stomach clenches because it doesn't matter if you're innocent. All it takes is one accusation. One bread warden with a grudge. One neighbor looking to bump you out of the market, and suddenly, you're the villain of the week. There's a documented case, still debated among historians, of a baker in Exeter who allegedly underweighed his loaves by a single ounce. Not once, but 3 days in a row. His punishment? Public shaming and the confiscation of every tool he owned. Some believe he was set up by a competitor. Others think it was a bread warden power trip. Either way, his name disappears from records after that. Poof, vanished. Bread ghost. These stories circulate like folk songs. Every baker knows them. Every apprentice hears them whispered before bed. They're cautionary tales, but they're also collective trauma. A reminder that baking in this age isn't a profession, it's a form of civic performance art under permanent surveillance. And the guilds? Well, they help. Sometimes. If you're part of a good one, they'll shield you from the worst of it. They'll provide grain forecasts, teach you shortcuts, maybe even bribe a bread warden or two. But most of the time, the guild's just another layer of rules, more dues, more hierarchy, more men in hats judging your crust from 30 paces. You once overheard a journeyman whisper that the guild meetings were like church, but with worse wine and more passive aggression. You believe it. Still, there's a strange kind of pride in it all. You've memorized the law not just because you have to, but because it's a mark of honor, a badge that says, "I survived this long." Every time you pull a tray of loaves from the oven and they pass inspection and they sell before noon, that's victory. Quiet, unspectacular, bread-flavored victory. And sometimes, just sometimes, you get to flex a little. Maybe a noble stops by your stall and declares your rye the softest west of the Thames. Maybe the mayor's cook buys your sweet loaf for the feast day.
Maybe a traveler takes one bite and asks if you learned to bake in London. You didn't, but you lie and say you did. Those moments? Gold. They don't erase the fear, the stress, the constant low-level dread of bread wardens or mold or inflation, but they do remind you that you're more than just a number on a chart. You're part of the thing that keeps your town fed, grounded, and slightly less riotous. Historians still argue whether the assize truly kept order or simply kept bakers in a state of low-grade panic. Some say it was necessary for economic equilibrium, others call it institutionalized cruelty. The truth is, probably both. It created consistency, yes, but at the cost of your sanity. But hey, no one riots over turnips. Bread? Bread starts revolutions. So you keep your head down, you fold the dough, you whisper the conversion chart like a prayer. Because tomorrow's market is coming, and your loaves won't shape themselves.
The morning fog rolls in like cold porridge, clinging to your skin and making the cobblestones sweat. You're hauling a basket of still warm loaves to your stall, dodging a cart full of dead fish, and trying not to slip on horse dung. Just a normal medieval Tuesday. You pass by the guild hall, and there they are, the bread wardens. Two of them, hunched like vultures over a scale, measuring someone's oat rounds to the last crumb. One of them squints at the loaf, then at the baker, then at his dusty scroll. You pretend not to notice. You adjust your hood, keep walking. You pray they're full. Because today, you tried something risky. It's not cheating. Not really. You just added a bit of mashed parsnip to the dough. Harmless. Filler. The monks do it all the time. But it's not technically in the law, and if a warden gets nosy and decides to poke a finger into your loaf, well, congratulations, you're a fraud. So why do it? Because the wheat prices spiked. Again. Because 3 customers last week complained your loaves were smaller than the tanner's lies. Because you need to stretch what little flour you have. Because your youngest child had a cough last night and the apothecary doesn't accept almost legal bread as payment. This is the dance every baker knows. Walk the line between innovation and accusation. You've seen what happens when someone stumbles. Remember Marcus? He was the best rye baker in town. One winter he tried adding chickpea flour during a shortage. It worked. Beautiful texture, nutty flavor, people loved it. Until someone snitched. Now he sells candles, quietly, out of a stall behind the tannery. The fear doesn't stop at ingredients either. It stretches into shape, crust color, even naming your bread.
You once labeled your sweet bun a feast curl. It sounded fancy. Someone reported you for misrepresenting a luxury item. You had to explain, in writing, to a clerk who looked like he hadn't eaten joy since the last coronation, that feast was metaphorical. He fined you anyway. Historians still argue whether the strictness of these naming laws was about consumer protection or just a creative way to punish upwardly mobile commoners who got a little too ambitious with their branding. Either way, the message was clear. Don't try to be clever. But you do. Sometimes. Quietly. Because being a baker in this world isn't just about flour and fire. It's about surviving boredom. The kind of deep, sticky boredom that comes from doing the same task every day, under threat of punishment. The only way to keep your brain from turning to boiled wheat is to find ways to keep it sharp. Tiny tweaks to recipes, little jokes etched in crust, whispered puns you tell the flour sack. Like naming your slightly burnt batch St. Crispin's Revenge, or calling the particularly lumpy loaf Bishop's Nose. Not everyone gets it, but a few customers smile when they see the name tags. One woman even gave you an extra coin for the night's blunder. A flat round, she said, looked like her ex-husband. Still, every small rebellion has its cost. The rules are watching. And then there's the competition. You're not the only one fighting to survive the bread gauntlet. There's Mira from 2 stalls over. Her spice bread is borderline divine, and you suspect she's got a cousin in the spice trade. There's Tomlin, the miller's son, who's too handsome and too lucky and bakes like someone who's never known a dry crust. You all smile at each other. You all watch each other. Every good morning is also a quiet inventory of who's thriving, who's slipping, who's one bad batch away from disaster. It's not open warfare, but it's not peace either. Sometimes you wonder how far someone would go to sabotage a rival. You've heard rumors of flour being salted, of loaves being stolen in the night, of anonymous tips leading wardens straight to someone's door. You've never done it. Yet. And then, there's the worst day of the month, weighing day. The bread wardens gather all the guild bakers. They inspect loaves, read ledgers, ask impossible questions. How many ounces should a 2-farthing loaf weigh if the quarter of wheat is 4 shillings and the coin used is clipped by 2%? You start sweating just hearing it. You bring your loaves, your very best ones. You polish your scale stones, you rehearse your lines, and still, you worry. What if your scale's off by a hair? What if your apprentice used the wrong flour sack? What if one of your rivals accidentally swapped your dough bowls before dawn? You once saw a baker hauled out of the hall in silence. No shouting, no protest, just gone. You don't know what happened to him. No one does. His stall's empty now, and his house is boarded up. You sometimes imagine him in a dungeon, explaining bread ratios to a confused jailer. That's the paranoia that clings to this job. It's not just about being good. It's about not being the one who gets noticed, not standing out too much, not failing too hard. So you go back to your stall. You smile at the customers, you sell your parsnip-laced loaf and call it Harvest Round, and hope the bread wardens don't ask questions. And when the last loaf is gone, you count your coins. You double-check your stock, and you go home and stare at the wall while your fingers twitch from invisible kneading. You're tired, but you'll get up again tomorrow, because the oven doesn't light itself. And because, against all odds, you still love the smell of rising dough. You wake to the familiar ache in your arms, the deep-set soreness that comes from kneading, hauling, lifting, and worrying your body into the shape of a functioning baker. Outside, the roosters haven't even bothered to crow yet, but you're already pulling on your flour-stained tunic, fingers sticky with yesterday's sleep. And what's on your mind before your feet even hit the ground? Bread prices. Not love, not poetry, not the sound of church bells or the dream of a softer mattress. Just numbers. Because every day, they shift. The market's a living beast. Some mornings it purrs. Prices low, customers happy, flour aplenty. Other days it bares its teeth, snarling with shortages, rot rumors, or another merchant barge delayed on the river. One soggy week can send the whole town into panic mode. And when that happens, guess who they look at first? You, the baker, the loaf maker, the alleged price manipulator. It doesn't help that the price of wheat is tied to 1,000 things you don't control. Wars in France, rainfall in Flanders, the whims of noble landlords who hoard grain like it's gold. You once heard that in 1 year, just one, a poor harvest combined with increased toll taxes, led to riots in 4 separate towns. And it all started with bread. You know this because the guild talks about it constantly. There's even a guild proverb. When the loaf grows thin, the blade grows close. It's not poetic. It's a warning. So what do? You become part baker, part economist. You check the grain scales like they're oracles. You whisper questions to the miller about incoming shipments. You learn to read between the lines of church sermons. When the friar starts talking about restraint in appetite, you know something's up. And always, you adjust. Sometimes you make the loaves smaller, denser. You call them travel loaves. Sometimes you bake with more bran, more chaff, anything to stretch it. Your regulars notice, sure, but they don't blame you. Not always. They're scared too. This is when the assize becomes your enemy and your shield. Technically, it's supposed to protect the customer. Standard weights, standard prices. But sometimes, in a weird twist of fate, it protects you. Because when things go sideways, you can point to the scroll, the math, the literal numbers burned into oak at the Guildhall. Not my fault, you say. The assize commands it. Still, there's always someone who thinks you're cheating.
A customer who stares too long at a loaf. A passerby who whispers,
That looks smaller than last week.
a rival who smirks and calls out,
Heavy crust for light coin, eh?
You swallow your pride. You stay calm, but it eats at you. One time, someone threw a rock at your stall. It wasn't aimed at you, just near. Angry. Hungry. They were muttering about their children not eating. You gave them a roll warm from the basket. They looked at you like you were either a savior or a fool, maybe both. Historians still argue whether medieval bakers were truly reviled or merely convenient scapegoats. Some sources depict them as essential civic workers, held in careful esteem. Others paint them as con artists always scheming to hoard flour. The truth, like your daily dough, is somewhere in the middle. Sticky, inconsistent, and hard to prove without burning your fingers. There are even rumors, probably false, that certain bakers conspired with millers to manipulate grain weights. One tale claims a baker in York kept hollow stones under his scales to trick customers. Another says a guild in Bristol used coded chalk marks on loaves to signal safe to buy versus filled with chalk. You've never seen it. But then again, you wouldn't. That's the point of a secret code. Still, you wonder. When Myra's spice bread is suspiciously affordable during a rye shortage, you tilt your head. When Tomlin sells white rolls in the dead of winter, you squint. You never accuse, but your eyebrow does the math. And yet, in the middle of all this suspicion, there's one group that always seems weirdly calm. The clergy. The monks. They bake too. Oh yes, some of them bake better than you. They have grain donations, fancy ovens, and time. And when prices spike, no problem. They give bread away and call it charity. You don't hate them. But sometimes you lie awake thinking about how nice it must be to have divine funding and zero rent. One time, you visited the monastery kitchen. It was clean, serene, filled with the scent of honey and spice. You asked their baker how he stayed so calm. He said, "We bake for God, not for gold." You smiled, and then went home and muttered, "Must be nice to have a sponsor." Still, you adapt. You keep going. Because while the system isn't fair, and the economy isn't stable, and the people aren't always kind, the bread is yours. You know its shape, its weight, the way it sounds when it cools. You trust it, more than you trust the mayor, the guild, or the weather. There's power in that. And when a child runs up to your stall, cheeks flushed, and says, "Mom says your crust is better than the friar's," you believe her. You give her an extra roll, you smile, you live to bake another day. You're halfway through another long day. Flour up to your elbows, dough in your fingernails, and the oven groaning like it resents being awake before dawn, when the knock comes. It's not frantic, not angry, just a firm thunk-thunk at your shop door. You wipe your hands, crack it open. There stands a man in faded robes. A clerk. Scroll under his arm, quill behind his ear, the kind of guy who hasn't smiled since the last eclipse. You know the type. Bureaucracy with legs. He clears his throat and hands you a parchment. No eye contact, no emotion, just a nod and gone. You open it, and your stomach sinks. A summons. You're being called to testify in a bread tribunal. Yes, that's a real thing. You sit down hard on the flour barrel, the paper crinkling in your hands. Someone's lodged a complaint. The tribunal's not about you, thank heavens, but you're listed as a witness. And not just any case, it's Mira's.
Suddenly, your heart tugs between dread and curiosity. This isn't the first tribunal you've seen. They're strange, formal little performances, somewhere between a courtroom and a public roast, sometimes held in the guild hall, sometimes for drama in the town square. The charge is almost always the same. Baker X violated the assize. But the reasons? Oh, those vary. Too small, too light, too much filler, false labeling. One guy last year was accused of passing off yesterday's bread as Holy Day fresh. He claimed divine staleness was still technically edible. Spoiler, it didn't go well. Historians still argue whether these tribunals were true legal institutions or more symbolic exercises in public discipline. Some records suggest they functioned like mini theatrical events, bread morality plays, if you will, designed to reinforce the authority of the guild and the law. Others think they were just practical tools for shaming small business owners into compliance. Both seem true, which is the most frustrating answer. Your role is simple. You're to confirm or deny whether Mira's spice loaves meet the standard size and weight. But that's not simple at all.
Because you like Mira. And her spice loaves? They're smaller, definitely. But they're good. And let's be honest. If spice were taxed the way it should be, you wouldn't even smell a clove in a loaf this size. She's probably cutting corners, but she's not robbing anyone. Still, the rules are the rules. And now the tribunal expects you to have memorized those rules. All 47 of them. You sigh. Again. The bread laws aren't numbered for fun. They're actual clauses, each maddeningly specific. Law 12? All wheaten loaves must weigh no less than 1/8 of a stone when sold at market within the mile of town center. Law 18? When barley be priced above 3 shillings the bushel, oat and lentil substitutions may be declared only under candlelight inspection. Who writes these? Seriously, candlelight inspections? The tribunal is held 3 days later. You dress your best, clean apron, newer boots, hair not smelling entirely of yeast. The hall is packed. Bakers, customers, even a few curious nobles leaning in from the back with mild amusement, like they're watching peasants wrestle over turnips. Mira stands near the front, composed but pale. A warden reads out the charges. Her loaves, it seems, have come in underweight for 3 consecutive weeks. Someone even presented a scribbled chart. Then they call you. You step forward, feet echoing on stone. The tribunal head, a man with the eternal frown of someone who once choked on a raisin and never forgave the concept, asks if you have any observations. You breathe in. You say, "Her loaves are small." A ripple, a few murmurs. Mira doesn't flinch. "But," you add, "they're honest. The crust is true, the weight matches the price, and the flavor, well, it shames the friars, frankly." That earns a laugh. Even the tribunal head allows a flicker of lip movement. They nod. They debate. They fine her, lightly. A slap on the wrist, really. The crowd dissipates. Afterwards, Mira gives you a nod. Not angry, not grateful, just seen. And as you walk home, you think about the balance you're constantly trying to strike. Truth and survival, honor and hunger, and how every time you speak, someone's livelihood shifts slightly. The tribunal wasn't about Nira. Not really. It was about fear.
Fear that someone's doing better than you. Fear that rules are being bent just far enough that you'll snap trying to keep up. Fear that the only thing keeping the bread world together is the threat of public shame. But also, just maybe, it's about keeping things decent. You remember an old tale told in the guild of a baker who sold loaves so light the pigeons laughed at them. He was fined, flogged, and forced to bake under supervision for a year. At the end of it, he said he was grateful, said he'd forgotten what real bread felt like in his hands. You don't know if that's true, but it sounds like something a tribunal would write down, frame,
and hang above the scales. And at the end of the day, after all the hearings, whisperings, and regulations, you go home and bake something just for yourself. No measurements, no rules, just instinct. It's ugly, it's uneven, it smells divine. You eat it warm, in silence, watching the smoke curl out of your chimney like a long exhale.
You're woken before dawn by the familiar boom of the town bell. But today, it's not marking time. It's summoning inspectors. You groan. Not because you're guilty, but because guilt has nothing to do with it. Inspections are random, inconsistent, and loaded with one terrifying truth. Even if you're innocent, you're probably still in trouble. They arrive in pairs, always, dressed in the town's dullest gray, carrying ledgers, measuring cords, and the dreaded scale stone. That chunk of iron isn't just a weight, it's a threat. If your bread doesn't match it, your coin purse won't either. You scramble to prepare, wipe down the counter, line up the loaves. You know today's batch is fine, better than fine, but still, your palms sweat like you've hidden a brick inside each bun. One of them steps in. He's young, overconfident. The kind of guy who tells his friends he enjoys being feared. His partner is older, slower, eyes like molasses, and twice as suspicious. Neither looks like they've ever baked a thing in their lives. They don't greet you, they just start prodding. Loaf after loaf, they slice, sniff, weigh, and scribble. You're not allowed to speak unless questioned, and even then, answers are expected to be short and deferential. This is not a negotiation, it's a performance, and you're the dough on stage. They hold up one of your best barley rounds. It's golden, crust perfect, weight accurate, but the younger one narrows his eyes and sniffs the crust with theatrical flourish. Smells earthy, he says. You resist the urge to say, "It's barley, what did you expect, violets?" Instead you nod, respectfully, politely, hatefully. Historians still debate how fair these inspections actually were. Some argue they upheld vital consumer protections in an age of survival-level scarcity. Others think they were often abused, tools for political pressure, rivalry sabotage, or plain old bureaucratic bullying. Evidence exists for both, of course. Some inspectors were honest men trying to feed a city. Others were just bored lords' nephews looking for an excuse to fine someone into bankruptcy. But for you, here and now, it's real, and stressful, and humiliating. The older one finally speaks. Your rye loaves, they've shrunk. Your stomach drops. Slightly, yes, you admit. New rye, denser grain. He frowns. Have you registered the variation? That's a thing you're supposed to do, technically. If your flour source changes and alters the bake, you're meant to notify the guild and register the difference. But nobody actually does it for every single batch. It's like announcing every time you sneeze. He writes it down anyway. You're fined 2 pence. Not a huge amount, but it's the principle. It'll go on your record. Too many of those and you'll lose your license. Because yes, bakers had licenses, actual permits to bake and sell, and if they were revoked, your entire livelihood vanished in a puff of flour. No second chances, no appeal, just you, out in the cold, watching someone else sell rolls from your old stall. You pay the fine without a word. You don't argue. Arguing is like flinging butter at a bonfire. It just makes the smoke thicker and your eyebrows shorter. After they leave, you take a moment to sit. Just sit. The shop is still. The loaves stare back at you, all smug and perfect now, of course. You think about your old mentor, Tomas. He once told you there's 2 kinds of bakers, those who fear inspections and those who lie about fearing them. He got fined 8 times in 1 year and still insisted he was the victim of a personal vendetta, orchestrated by the mayor's wife. You miss him. Still, your day goes on. People filter in, none the wiser to the drama. A young woman buys a roll and tucks it into her coat. A tired man drops a single coin for a crust and mumbles thanks. A nobleman's squire comes by to collect the pre-ordered honey loaves. 2 hours late, but you smile anyway.
because that's the job. You're a baker, but also a politician, a juggler, a silent sufferer of state scrutiny. And here's the strange twist. Despite all this nonsense, people still trust you. Maybe even more because of it. They know the system's watching. They know your hands are bound by regulation. And so, ironically, you become safer than the traveling peddler or the home-baking widow who sells unauthorized buns from her windowsill. Customers complain, sure. They whine about prices, portions, dryness, but when the fire alarm in their life rings, they come running to you. Because your bread is legal, your crusts have been approved by council, your buns passed the sniff test of the greasiest inspector in town. You're not just a baker, you're a state-certified lifeline, and as weird as that is, it's also kind of empowering. You bake with purpose now, not just to sell, but to prove you can survive under pressure, under rules, under eyes. You think of the loaves as small rebellions, perfectly legal, perfectly weighted rebellions. There's dignity in that. And when the day winds down, when the stall is mostly empty and your apron is a map of the day's battles, you take one of those rye loaves, the ones that shrunk, and tear it open. Steam billows, the crust crackles. You dip it in honey. It tastes like quiet victory.
You wake up in the dead of night with a sudden realization. You forgot to adjust your chalkboard prices again. It's barely past midnight, but your brain is already racing ahead. Because in this medieval world, the price of bread isn't something you choose. It's dictated by grain markets, weather patterns, and a rotating cast of semi-literate town scribes who measure inflation using sheep gossip and bad math. You shuffle outside in your nightshirt, breath misting in the cool dark, and fix the sign. 2 pence for a wheat round, 1 for barley. No one sees you, except a cat, who clearly judges you. By sunrise, the price might change again. Welcome to the feast or famine economy, where bread prices fluctuate like medieval cryptocurrency. You don't set your prices, you obey them. And that's not just some friendly suggestion. In many towns, violating the set bread price, known formally under the assize of bread, was a punishable offense, a real one, with trials, stocks, fines, even public humiliation, if your buns were cheeky enough. Historians still argue whether these shifting prices actually helped the average consumer or just kept poor bakers perpetually anxious. Some records suggest the goal was to prevent famine profiteering, stop greedy merchants from selling overpriced loaves during grain shortages. But others think it mainly protected elites who wanted stability for their dinner tables, not yours. You see both sides, but mostly, you see your math slate. Because once again, you need to recalculate your dough. This is where it gets messy.
Say you buy a sack of wheat flour for 10 shillings. You're supposed to sell loaves at a rate that reflects that cost plus a standard profit margin, one that's been predetermined by the Guild Council and updated weekly by a guy who once passed out in the barley bin during town fair. But wheat quality changes, your baking fuel costs change. Sometimes a mouse chews through your oats and suddenly you're down half a sack. And through all of this, the rule remains. If the cost of ingredients changes, you must adjust the weight or price of the bread to match. You know what that means, right? You're not just a baker, you're a human calculator. And this was before calculators. So every single day, you do what every baker before you has done. Mental gymnastics that would make modern tax accountants weep. You scrawl flour costs, estimate daily yield, divide it by loaf weight, subtract for losses, and then, finally, come up with your legal loaf size and price for the next 24 hours. And if you get it wrong, if your loaves are too small for the price you've charged, back to tribunal you go. Even worse, the townspeople start whispering that your bread is thin, that you've gone greedy, that you're cutting it. A term that always sounds more sinister when applied to carbs. You remember one winter, years ago, when a freak frost ruined the barley crops. Prices soared overnight, and suddenly your regulars couldn't afford their usual rolls. One mother came in, her child wrapped in more holes than cloth, and asked if she could trade buttons for crusts. You gave her the whole loaf. That night, you were scolded by the guild for undermining pricing authority. But what were you supposed to do?
Let a toddler go hungry so the town accountant could balance his grain scrolls? Even now, you think about that moment every time you adjust your chalkboard. It's more than economics, it's ethics. But here's the catch. You're not always the victim in this story. Sometimes, when prices drop and your ingredients are cheap, you're expected to either increase the loaf size or drop the cost. You know what that means? Less profit, more work, larger loaves for the same coin.
Which ironically makes some bakers resent abundance. You chuckle to yourself. How medieval is that? Wishing grain were more expensive just so you didn't have to make double the bread for the same income? Still, you push on, because pricing is a dance. And while the steps are complicated, you've learned the rhythm. You keep one ear to the grain sellers, one eye on the town crier, and both hands firmly on your flour sack. It's exhausting, but there's something strangely comforting in it. A system, a structure, 1,000 little numbers guiding your life like invisible strings. You don't control them, but at least you know them. And that gives you just enough certainty to keep going. Then again, sometimes you dream about being a fisherman. Just fish. Sell the fish. Done. But you probably miss the smell of bread, the quiet moments when the dough rises perfectly, the way a child's eyes light up when you hand them a heel still warm from the oven. So, you chalk your prices. You measure your loaves. You memorize laws written before your grandfather's grandfather was born. And you do it all with cracked hands and an aching back. Because someone has to. And maybe, just maybe, there's dignity in that. As the sun rises and the first sleepy customer wanders in, you nod toward your updated board and say, "Prices changed overnight. Sorry." They smile. "That's all right. You still make the best bread in town." You wrap the loaf, place it in their arms, and watch them walk off through the early fog. You smile too, because for all the math and the madness and the migraine-inducing laws, this part, the human part, is what keeps you going, even if tomorrow the price changes again.
You're halfway through your morning need when it hits you. Today's the day of the weights audit. You freeze mid-push, dough clinging to your fingers like an over-affectionate puppy. The scales, the counterweights, the tiny metal discs with those worn-down numbers etched into them. You were supposed to clean them last night. Make sure none were chipped or warped or, heaven forbid, tampered with. Because here's the wildest part of this bread-filled bureaucratic fever dream you call life. Even your measuring tools have rules. Each baker in town is required to own an official set of standard weights, registered with the local guild, kept in good condition, and subject to surprise inspection at any time. And not just for show. You use them daily to weigh dough, portion ingredients, and double-check final loaf mass before it hits the counter. Because if your 2-penny loaf doesn't weigh exactly what the assize demands today, that's a fine. Again. Oh, and don't even think about swapping in a chipped weight or filing one down to save a little flour. That's not a baking error, that's fraud. As in, stocks and rotten fruit levels of fraud. Historians still debate whether bakers really frequented the stocks as often as legend claims. Some say it was rare, save for repeat offenders. Others believe towns loved the public spectacle and would haul bakers out for the tiniest misstep. One surviving ordinance from 14th century England reads, "If a baker's bread be found light, let him be drawn upon a hurdle through the streets, with the offending loaf tied about his neck." So, yeah, even the punishments were themed. You scramble to the back room and check your scale. The brass is tarnished but intact. The counterweights are all present. Half-pound, quarter, 1 penny weight, one you swear is shaped like a frog. You test them against your master stone, standard practice, and breathe a sigh of relief when the balance holds. Still, the pressure is constant. Because everyone assumes bakers are secretly greedy, that you'll shave a few crumbs off the top when no one's looking. And look, you get it. Bread is daily. Bread is essential. Bread is, for many, the only stable food on the table.
So the second someone feels shorted, by weight, price, size, or crust, they come for you like you're the lord of the loaf himself. There was that infamous case in Norwich where a baker accidentally sold 3 loaves underweight by a few ounces. Word spread, and within hours, his entire stall was flipped over and his apron stuffed in his mouth. Towns took bread justice very seriously. And the thing is, you want your customers to trust you. You want them to know you're fair, that your scales are honest, that your bread's not pumped full of weird additives. Oh, right. Let's talk about those. See, in bad harvest years or when flour got expensive, some less than saintly bakers would stretch their dough with alternative ingredients. Not dangerous ones, usually. Think ground peas, mashed turnips, stale breadcrumbs, and, in more desperate corners of history, powdered bones or clay. Yum. These fillers weren't technically illegal, unless you didn't declare them, but they were considered shady at best and scandalous at worst. You remember when that one baker down the street got caught using sawdust in his rye loaves? Sawdust. Not even the edible kind. Town officials shut him down so fast, his oven didn't even have time to cool. So, back to your own shop. You clean your scale until it gleams, line up the weights in proud little rows, and test them again. You even check the tiny slotted spoon you use to portion out salt, because, yes, even salt had to be exact. And just in time, because there they are. 2 guild members, both wearing robes that look like someone ironed them with passive aggression. One carries a clipboard. The other, a short woman with hair like steel wool, has a portable scale in a locked box. They're not here for bread. They're here for tools. She holds up your counterweights one by one, measures them against her standard, nods, scribbles, grunts. It feels more like a dental exam than an audit. You smile through it anyway. Then she asks the real question. How often do you recalibrate? You answer honestly. Twice a week, with a guild stone. She raises an eyebrow, but says nothing. Write something instead. You will never see that note. It could say, excellent practice, or possible liar. You'll never know. But finally, after what feels like an eternity of silent judging, they leave. No fines, no warnings. You're clean. And exhausted. Still, there's a strange comfort in it, isn't there? That in this chaotic medieval circus of mud streets and hungry mouths, someone is watching the tools. Someone's making sure that what you call half a pound is the same as what the next guy calls it. It's stability, precision, maybe even fairness, in its own oppressive way. Later that day, a customer, an old man with fingers like tree roots, asks you, "Do you still weigh your bread proper, lad?" You grin. Always. Even the salt. He nods like that's the best answer he's heard in weeks. Buys a barley round, walks off humming. And as you knead tomorrow's dough under the flicker of lamplight, you feel something rare and golden settle.
It's well past dark when the knock comes. Not a customer, not a neighbor. No, it's them, the guild reps, again. This time, they're not here to weigh your bread or inspect your tools. They're here for a record check. That's right. Welcome to the thrilling underworld of medieval bakery bookkeeping. Try not to fall asleep just yet, though, because this part might be the most absurdly high-stakes one of all. See, you're not just a baker, you're a certified data entry clerk, too. Behind your front room, where the warm smells of nutty crust and ash still linger, you keep a leather-bound ledger. It's cracked, soot-smudged, and faintly flour-dusted, but it holds everything. Every flour purchase, every loaf sold, every grain shipment received, every change in pricing, every interaction with the guild. All of it. Logged by hand, with a quill that keeps fraying, on parchment that bleeds when it rains. And tonight,
The guild wants to see the last 6 months. Historians still argue whether record-keeping like this was widespread among smaller village bakers or just a feature of urban, guild-governed towns. Either way, you don't get the luxury of skipping it, because if something in your logs doesn't add up, if you bought 20 pounds of flour and sold 300 loaves, if your wheat prices don't match the market rates, boom, penalties, fines. In worst cases, suspension of baking rights. And let's be clear, that's not just a slap on the wrist, that's full-on livelihood death. Once your baking rights are suspended, you're not allowed to sell a crumb, not even give away old crusts. You become a culinary ghost. So yeah, you take the ledger seriously, you hand it over. The senior rep squints at your looping script and nods. His assistant, probably not even 20, trails a finger down the column labeled Midwinter Barley Purchases. Stops. Frowns. "Why did you buy twice your usual amount this February?" she asks. You blink. Because that's when Farmer Ellis came by with the frost-damaged surplus at half price. You thought you were being clever. Stockpiling, you say, casually. Had the storage space, figured it'd stretch. She hums and writes a note. For the next hour, you stand silently as they read your entire economic life. You've got nothing to hide, but still, your palms sweat. Your breath shortens. This is how crime thrillers start, you think, with an innocent person nervously watching someone flip pages. Eventually, the rep snaps the ledger closed. It's thorough, he says, a bit flour smudged. You chuckle. Comes with the job. They leave. Again, no fines, no lectures, but you feel like you've aged 5 years. You sink into your stool and flip back through the ledger yourself. The ink's faded in places. One entry in late spring is nearly illegible, probably written after an all-nighter. The page from harvest season is torn and mended with beeswax. But it's all you, your handwriting, your numbers, your struggle, captured line by line.
There's something almost poetic about it. In a time before spreadsheets or apps, this was your truth. Every number you inked told a story. Like the winter you could only afford rye, and your profits dipped so low, you made barley cookies just to stay afloat. Or the summer, you accidentally quadrupled your output because a noble ordered bread for a wedding and forgot to pay. Ah, yes. That one still stings. You remember scribbling in the margins that day. Never trust a noble with soft hands. You started doodling in the blank corners of your pages. Small things. Wheat stalks, burned crusts, a tiny rat in a chef's hat. It's dumb, sure, but it keeps you sane. Because bookkeeping isn't just about compliance. It's memory. It's continuity. You've even started tracking oddities, like which day the village kids ask for more bread ends, or when the flour smells weird because the miller didn't clean his stones. Or, your favorite, the rare day when everything goes right, and the loaves crack open with a perfect bloom, and you sell out before noon. Those entries are rare, but they shine like gold. Still, the system has its flaws. You're required to estimate spoilage, which means guessing how much bread went stale before it sold, and how much flour you lost to humidity or pests. These numbers are pure fiction, but if you forget to include them, the guild will accuse you of over-reporting profits, which is somehow just as bad as under-reporting. You sigh. Sometimes it feels like you spend more time with ink than dough. But then the bells ring out across the square, and a small child appears at your window, nose pressed to the glass. You wave them in. They ask for the round one, with the burnt bottom, and you smile. Because that's the one only you make like that, by accident, every time. They hand you a coin and run off, cradling the bread like it's treasure. You glance back at the ledger, still open, still honest. And you wonder, long after you're gone, if someone finds these books in some dusty attic, will they understand? Will they see the care between the lines? The quiet resilience? Or will they just wonder why anyone needed to document 47 laws to sell something as simple as bread? You hope it's the former. And if not, well, maybe they'll at least appreciate the tiny rat in a chef hat on the back page. You wake up coughing. Not because you're sick, but because the oven smoke snuck in again.
It curls through the ceiling boards, smelling of scorched flour and something else. Ashes. Maybe a hint of barley crust that went too long. You sit up, blinking through the haze. And that's when you realize your apprentice forgot to scrape the flue again. You swear softly. Nothing profane, just the medieval equivalent of, "Seriously, Kevin?" And shuffle out of bed to inspect the damage. The air's thick. Your throat's scratchy. The oven, still glowing faintly from last night's bake, belches one final puff of black, and then settles. You open the flue yourself, tapping it with the iron rod. Soot rains down like festive snow, if snow smelled like regret and looked like ground-up despair. You're going to have to clean the chimney. Again. But hey, this is part of baking too. Not just loaves and ledgers. No, you're also a chimney sweep, a soot negotiator, a part-time smoke detective. Because medieval baking, it comes with oven drama. Let's talk about the oven, your sacred, temperamental beast. It's stone-lined, wood-fired, and deeply moody. You didn't just buy it. You inherited it. A massive, domed thing built right into the sidewall of your shop. Older than you, older than your grandfather, probably older than the concept of punctuality. It takes 2 hours to heat up, eats logs like a dragon, and has to be managed like a toddler with a temper. You can't just set a timer. You have to feel the heat. Stick your arm inside for a second. No more. Sprinkle a handful of flour on the hearthstone and watch how fast it chars. Tap the dome and listen to the sound. Low and hollow? Too cool. Sharp and pinging? Just right. Historians still argue whether bakers used actual temperature indicators or just passed down secret rituals to know when the oven was ready. The truth is likely both. You've got tricks, sure, but mostly it's muscle memory, a sixth sense, oven feng shui. You remember when you were still learning. You once burned 12 loaves in one morning. 12. Your mentor said nothing, just looked at the blackened bread and muttered, "Feed it to the pigs." You didn't touch the oven again for a week. And now, years later, it's your turn to train the next poor soul. Let's call him Tom. Tom has no idea what he's doing. He's 16, full of energy, and convinced that turning the fire up faster makes the loaves rise better. You've tried explaining thermal saturation, and even did the flour on the hearth trick for him. He just nodded solemnly, and then, I kid.
Today, you're baking a mix. Rye rounds, barley braids, and a single fancy wheat loaf for a merchant who thinks bread should look luxurious. Whatever that means. Each type needs a different placement. Barley loaves go toward the front, cooler zone, longer bake. Rye rounds near the middle. The fancy wheat gets the sweet spot. Hottest center, shortest bake, fastest bloom. You use a wooden peel, a long-handled paddle, to slide the dough inside. It takes skill not to tip it or drop the loaf sideways. You've done it in your sleep before, literally. Once, during festival week, you napped standing up and kept baking. You woke up with a half-risen roll in your hand. Let's not talk about that. The oven crackles behind you, warm and alive. It smells like toast and earth and childhood, like comfort, like work. And while it's baking, you clean, because there's always ash everywhere, in the corners, under the bins, stuck to your apron. You wipe down the counters, sweep the coals, and check the dough waiting for the next round. Then comes a moment of magic. The pop. It's not loud, more like a soft release of tension, but you hear it. The sound of the loaf cracking open at the top as it expands. You peek inside, and there it is. Your wheat showpiece, blooming in the heat like a desert flower. You grin. Still got it. But ovens can betray you.
You remember that one autumn when a rat built a nest behind the fire brick. You only found out when the entire back wall started smelling wrong. Or the time the chimney blocked and you had to bake with the door cracked open, rotating loaves every 5 minutes like a manic pizza chef. You've even heard of bakers who built secret tunnels to pipe heat into their ovens more efficiently. Probably illegal, definitely genius. You pull the first batch out. Barley loaves, crackly on the outside, dense and sweet within. You tap the bottoms. Hollow thunk. Perfect. Tom peers over your shoulder. Do you ever get bored of this? You pause. Look at the golden rounds steaming in the cool morning air. No, you say simply. I get tired. I get annoyed. But not bored. Because there's something real about this. Fire, flour, timing, sweat. It doesn't lie. You can't cheat it. You can't rush it. You either get it right or the crust burns. And everyone knows. There's no pretending. You place the loaves on the rack where customers will eye them, sniff them, squeeze them too hard even though you tell them not to. But first, they'll see the crust. That deep, rich brown, blistered at the edges, dusted in flour like a sugared relic. And they'll know. This wasn't made by accident. You glance at your oven, now dimming with spent embers.
You never thought you'd say this, but some days, the highlight of your job is listening. Not baking, not bookkeeping, not shouting at Tom for almost setting the drying rack on fire again. No, the best part might just be the steady, unfiltered gossip pipeline that flows straight through your bakery door every morning, like clockwork. Because when you're the town baker in the Middle Ages, you're not just a tradesperson. You're a community nerve center. The morning crowd starts forming before dawn, and it's the same parade of personalities. There's Marjorie, who insists her barley loaf be shaped like a heart or it tastes funny. There's old Henrik, who doesn't say a word but always buys yesterday's crust to feed what he claims is a talking goat. You don't ask. And of course, there's the widow Lane. She doesn't really like bread, but she likes being seen buying bread. Her visits include a running commentary on who's expecting, who's fighting, and who just vanished after last Sunday's sermon. Did you hear, she says, leaning over your counter like you're her personal confessor? Sir Gilbert's youngest was caught stealing cinnamon buns from the manor kitchen. Can you imagine? That boy always smelled too sweet. You nod solemnly, passing her a small rye roll that she won't eat. Historians still argue whether these bakeries acted as informal gathering spots or if that's romanticizing them. But in your experience, absolutely true. You've learned more from butterfingered nobles and impatient grandmothers than from any town crier. It's not all pleasant, of course. Some days you get angry lords demanding you explain exactly why their loaf has fewer caraway seeds than last time. You try not to laugh, but seriously, maybe count them yourself next time, your nobleness. But between all the madness, there's something oddly beautiful about this stream of souls. Because each loaf you hand over becomes a little thread in their lives. You know which kid is sick when their mother asks for extra soft bread. You know someone's in mourning when they skip the honey crust. You remember the baker before you telling tales of families who bought the same loaf every week for 3 decades until their great-grandkids took over. Bread is memory. And you're the memory keeper. You've also become the emergency contact. Someone's goat won't birth? They ask the baker. Lost your shoe in the river? Ask the baker. Need a neutral party for a marriage contract dispute because someone brought spiced loaves instead of plain? Yep, you guessed it. The weirdest request you ever got? That guy who asked if you could bake a message inside the loaf, like a love letter. She'll tear it open and read it, he said. You tried. It mostly turned into a soggy, ink-smeared blob. She married someone else. You still think about that poor loaf.
One of your favorite customers, though, is a little girl named Agnes. She's missing a front tooth, always sticky from jam, and pays in buttons. Not even good buttons, like weird ones. You take them anyway. She always asks,
Did you bake the moon loaf yet?
You did once, just for her. round, brushed with milk, dusted in flour so it looked like craters. You told her it was made with midnight flour harvested by candlelight. She screamed in joy and told every other child in the village. You haven't had a quiet morning since, but honestly, you don't mind, because each one of these people, with their odd habits and broken coins and strange stories, makes your job human. You see them grow up, fall in love, grieve, hope, and through it all, you're right there, elbow deep in dough, listening. Even the church folk drop by. The priest buys oat loaves for penitent digestion, whatever that means. One nun asked if you'd ever considered shaping bread into saints. You said no, but now you're weirdly tempted. Saint Caraway of the Burnt Bottom has a ring to it. You overhear the rhythm of the town through small things. Who's buying extra? Who's buying less? When grain shortages hit, people whisper, but you see the truth in their orders. People going hungry won't always admit it out loud. That's why you started leaving the end pieces on the window ledge at night. No one asks, but by morning, they're gone. And then there's market day. You drag out your best loaves, stack them like golden bricks, and wait. The square buzzes, merchants shouting, kids chasing chickens, someone playing a lute terribly. Your booth becomes a little oasis of warmth, and everyone stops by. The magistrate, the traveling dentist, yes, that's a thing. Even the jester from 3 villages over, who insists you bake his nose bread extra long so it has a crunch. That night, as you close the shutters and scrape dough from your sleeves, you think, no one ever warned you that baking would mean being this embedded, this emotionally tangled. No one said your heart would rise and fall with other people's crusts. But maybe they should have, because it's not just about flour or fire or fines. It's about feeding lives, with all the joy, drama, and sticky buttons that come with it. And tomorrow the line will form again, and someone will say, "You know what I heard," just as you're brushing flour off the counter, and you'll lean in, pass them a fresh roll, and listen, like always.
Some people dream of a quiet life, a peaceful job, predictability. You've got bread heists. It starts, like most things in the Middle Ages, with a mysterious disappearance. You count your loaves in the morning just like always. 48 barley, 16 rye, 4 of the fancy merchant wheat with a crosshatch top. But now, there are only 3. 1 is gone. You blink, recount, blink again. Then, you spot it. The smudge on the windowsill. A streak of flour. A tiny round footprint in yesterday's cooling ash. Oh no, it's happened again. The bread snatcher is back. You let out a long sigh, the kind that only comes from weeks of stolen loaves and 0 solid suspects. You've asked around. You've watched the alley. You even set up a decoy loaf once, stuffed with sour turnips. It disappeared anyway. Either you're dealing with a very dumb thief or a very hungry one. Historians still argue whether food theft in small towns was treated harshly or quietly forgiven. In your village, it's complicated. Everyone acts outraged, but deep down, they all kind of love a good scandal, especially when it involves mysterious crumbs. You inform Tom, who immediately suggests laying a bear trap by the oven. You inform Tom he's no longer allowed to make suggestions before breakfast. The truth is, you don't want to get anyone in trouble. Not really. You're just curious. Because, whoever it is, they're good. They never take more than 1. Always in the early hours. Never the same kind twice. Like they're sampling, reviewing. You imagine the thief keeping a secret notebook. Barley, chewy, notes of smoke, 3 stars. Honey rye, exquisite crust, sticky fingers, 5 stars. One night, you decide to wait. You pretend to close the bakery, douse the lamps, leave one slightly too perfect loaf on the edge of the counter, right beneath the open window. Then, you sit in the corner, cloaked, silent, eyes peeled. Midnight ticks by. You nearly fall asleep. The oven's still warm behind you, like a stone dragon napping.
Then, rustle. A tiny sound. A shadow moves across the window. You hold your breath. And in clambers a child, no older than 7, barefoot, wrapped in a cloak made from what looks like an old potato sack. She creeps up to the loaf, takes it in both hands with the reverence of someone holding a sacred relic, and then starts to crawl back out. You clear your throat softly. She freezes. "Do you like it?" you ask. The child whirls around, eyes wide. For a second, you think she might bolt. But then she shrugs. "It's not bad."
Noted, you reply. Long story short, you give her the loaf and a small roll for the road. And then, the next night, she brings her little brother. By the end of the week, you've got 5 tiny goblins sneaking in for bread. Turns out they live on the edge of the woods, orphans from a burned-out village a few towns over. You remember hearing about it. Raiders, or maybe a fire. No one really knew. The kids barely speak, except for the girl with the critiques. She's the loud one. You don't tell anyone. You just start baking extra. Leave it on the windowsill at night, wrap it in cloth when it's cold. Sometimes you add a bit of jam if you're feeling generous. Once, you even included a note that just said, "You are not invisible." The next morning, there was a button on your counter. You still have it. Brass, dented, shaped like a star. And somehow, it means more to you than most coins. Because here's the thing people don't always get about medieval bread. It's not just sustenance. It's currency. It's status. It's law. It's sacred. But above all, it's power. The power to feed. The power to comfort. The power to reach across gaps, across silence, across the heaviness of history, and say, "You're still human. You still matter." You start noticing the other ones too. The older woman who buys the broken loaves for soup but never buys anything else. The boy who waits until everyone's gone to ask, very quietly, if you have anything stale but not too stale. The couple who only come in after dark, hooded, silent, always looking over their shoulders. So, you start leaving more out. You don't say anything. You just bake and let the bread speak. Of course, not everyone approves. One merchant complains that the poor loaves are too good and might tempt common people to eat above their station. You smile at him, then double the honey in the next poor loaf batch. Because what are they going to do? Arrest you for kindness? The local scribe tries to explain that bread equality isn't sustainable. You hand him a roll. He eats it without breaking eye contact. So here you are, in a town with 47 bread laws, one of which probably says don't feed bandits or feral children. And yet, you do. You always will. Because at some point, the job stopped being about bread and started being about people. Not customers, not fines, not rules, just hungry souls, quietly asking to be seen. You wake up coughing. Not because you're sick, but because the oven smoke snuck in again. It curls through the ceiling boards, smelling of scorched flour and something else. Ashes. Maybe a hint of barley crust that went too long. You sit up, blinking through the haze. And that's when you realize your apprentice forgot to scrape the flue again. You swear softly. Nothing profane, just the medieval equivalent of, "Seriously, Kevin?" And shuffle out of bed to inspect the damage. The air's thick, your throat's scratchy. The oven, still glowing faintly from last night's bake, belches one final puff of black, and then settles. You open the flue yourself, tapping it with the iron rod. Soot rains down like festive snow, if snow smelled like regret, and looked like ground-up despair. You're going to have to clean the chimney. Again. But hey,
This is part of baking too, not just loaves and ledgers. No, you're also a chimney sweep, a soot negotiator, a part-time smoke detective. Because medieval baking, it comes with oven drama. Let's talk about the oven, your sacred, temperamental beast. It's stone-lined, wood-fired, and deeply moody. You didn't just buy it, you inherited it. A massive, domed thing built right into the sidewall of your shop. Older than you, older than your grandfather, probably older than the concept of punctuality. It takes 2 hours to heat up, eats logs like a dragon, and has to be managed like a toddler with a temper. You can't just set a timer. You have to feel the heat. Stick your arm inside for a second. No more. Sprinkle a handful of flour on the hearthstone and watch how fast it chars. Tap the dome and listen to the sound. Low and hollow? Too cool. Sharp and pinging? Just right. Historians still argue whether bakers used actual temperature indicators or just passed down secret rituals to know when the oven was ready. The truth is likely both. You've got tricks, sure, but mostly it's muscle memory, a sixth sense, oven feng shui. You remember when you were still learning. You once burned 12 loaves in one morning. 12. Your mentor said nothing, just looked at the blackened bread and muttered, "Feed it to the pigs." You didn't touch the oven again for a week. And now, years later, it's your turn to train the next poor soul. Let's call him Tom. Tom has no idea what he's doing. He's 16, full of energy, and convinced that turning the fire up faster makes the loaves rise better. You've tried explaining thermal saturation, and even did the flour on the hearth trick for him. He just nodded solemnly, and then, I kid, some sleepy grad student in a hoodie, staring at a textbook, squinting at footnotes about medieval baking practices. Will they know how deeply it mattered? How political it was to mix a bit of barley in a wheat loaf? How entire rebellions started over bread prices? How every market riot had at least one burned baker cart at the center? Probably not. But maybe that's okay, because history is built on quiet things, forgotten things. Things like the sound of dough slapping a wooden board, like warm crust handed to a child too fast so they burn their tongue, but don't care. Like a secret message scratched into the bottom of a merchant's loaf, like 5 orphans giggling with jam-smeared faces under the stars. That's what survives, even if the names don't. And you'll be part of that. A ghost in the grains, a whisper in the crust. Tomorrow, you'll rise before dawn again. You'll light the oven, you'll check the scales. You'll try to remember if Rule 22 was about weights or wheat origin. You'll miss it by a hair, but the bread will still be good, and someone will eat it, and close their eyes, and feel just a little less alone. And you'll be right there, behind the counter, smiling, just like always. And now, as the final crumbs settle and the oven cools to silence, your body relaxes. You feel the weight of the day lifting, the gentle warmth of that last loaf radiating from your memory like a fading hearth fire. You are no longer in the medieval shop. The laws, the fines, the counting of ounces, they drift away like flour in the breeze. What remains is softness, familiarity, peace. Your hands are no longer tired. They rest. The crackle of crust is replaced by the slow rhythm of your breath, steady and calm. The town sleeps. The inspectors sleep. Even the secret bread thieves are curled up somewhere, bellies full, dreaming of rye moons and oat stars. You hear the faint hum of a distant fan, maybe real, maybe imagined, a steady sound, like the heartbeat of time passing gently. You remember the feel of dough in your palms, stretchy, alive, forgiving. You remember the scent of honey in the air, the joy of small things, the surprise of kindness in unexpected places. You were part of something, weren't you? Even if no one remembers your name, your warmth remains, passed from hand to hand, loaf to loaf. It's okay to let go now. Close your eyes, sink deeper into the blankets. Let your thoughts be like breadcrumbs, scattered in dreams, waiting to be gathered in the morning light. You've done enough. You are enough. The world can wait. Sleep now. Sleep.